Hello everyone, this is the Sage of Calidor coming to you with another video on the Numenor Civilization series. Today we are going to be talking about the first Queen of Numenor, actually, Tar and Ancalimë, and this one is going to be interesting. So, Ancalimë was born in the Second Age, very like 873, and she's the first and only child of Aldarion, who is the king's heir, and the subject of the last video. And when she was young, her father left his family to return to the sea, which, as we know in the last video, he was trying to help the elves with something. But her mother was Erendis, and Erendis at this point grew bitter with the amount of time that he was gone. And she took her young daughter to the pastures, and her mother had a great deal of influence on her upbringing. I mean, Ancalimë learned Elvish. She learned much of Numenor and its history, but Arendis grew bitter towards men and taught her to hate men, essentially. And she did so deliberately. Like, she had very few interactions with men growing up. The only people around her were women. And her first encounter was with a boy, like around when she's around 7. Um, and um, and one of the female servants told the boy to run off, and um, she asked the servant who was this boy, and if the boy had a father, and she was told that the boy's father was one of the adventurers who'd gone off with her father, Aldarion. So she later asked if who Aldarion was her father, asked her mother, and when he will return, and this angered him. I mean, angered Arendis a lot. Like, she was furious. But when she was like around 10, her father returned, and Aldarion promised to make her his heir. And soon after he arrived at to meet with his father, gave him that letter from Gil-galad, and soon after, her father was crowned king of Numenor, and he sent a letter to ask Arendis to come and bring Ancalimë with her. Arendis refused, but Ancalimë went. Well, she was a lot like her mother, but she also had her father's traits of being resolute, and she understood Aldarion's anger towards Arendis, but believed her mother was correct in her treatment. And she shared Arendis's dislike towards men and a dislike for marriage, but she was less prim than her mother and liked jewels, music, admiration, and deference. And uh um for a while she actually played her parents off against each other, trying to get what she wanted, and I think you can say her father won out, technically speaking. And No one knows what happened between the years her father returned and the year she became queen, but she spent some of her times in both Armenelos and Emery, and her grandmother on her father's side, Almerian, took a great liking to her, and and this actually worked very well. But when her father became king, uh, he changed the law of succession, and under this new law, the king's heir would be the eldest child of the king or queen, regardless of gender. Now, at just 19 years old, she was proclaimed the king's heir. She with spent some time withdrawing to the country estate, and she spent her time in the sheep lands. It was called the Princess Shepherd, and she's rejected by all sort of people, men courting her, and she grew close to a shepherd called Mam Andil, and she could tell he was beginning to fall for her, but she did not like men, and so he basically said, so when he told her, "I love you, I care for you," she said, I can't marry you. I'm the king's heir. It would be inappropriate." But he said, "That's no problem. I'm the son of Helikar, and I wanted us to get to know each other, and I decided to get to know us to get to know each other as a person." Well, his deceit greatly angered her, but instead and she used that as an excuse of saying, "I am not going to marry you." But to be perfectly honest, even if he was honest with her and tried to approach her as a person, I think she would say no. But in the end, she wed Halakir in the year Second Age 1000 because, well, she wanted to spite a cousin of hers, so he does not get the throne. And she had only one child called Anarian, and she she did not like the idea of having a child, and said, "May I become like Queen Omarion and dot upon him?" And she just gave the son to her husband to raise, and there was strife between the two of them, and she sought to take his lands and forbade him to dwell upon them and reduced him to the status of a steward, which went entirely against Numenorian law. So there is that. And also, she forbidden her serving women to marry, but in response, her husband made secretly arrange their weddings and wedding feasts at his old house before he left it. Um, and so there was that. When her father surrendered the scepter, she became the first ruling queen of Numenor, and she would actually rule very long. Uh, the second longest ruler of Numenor. Nothing said of her policies up until her father's death, say a few decades later. My guess is out of obligation to her father and his influence. While she was building influence of her own, she followed his policies because it said that she neglected his policies and no longer provided help to Gil-galad and Lindon. So my guess is she still respected her father somewhat or did not want to get into a fight with him. But she had 3 grandchildren through her son, 2 elder granddaughters, and a younger son named Surian. And her 2 granddaughters feared and disliked her. and refused the heirship to the scepter, and in revenge, she would not allow them to marry, and they remained unwed. I don't know what was going on, but I think the terms feared and disliked her meant something. I've been doing some thinking, and I feel like she had those two poor girls under her thumb and basically, essentially, forced them, like, made concessions like, if you want the scepter, I think one is you have to go over your father, which was something none of them wanted to do. Also, they realized they would have no choice in their husbands, and she would pick a husband that benefited her in their lives, and their children's lives would not be lives but pieces on a board, her board, and they did not want it. So rather, they did not want to be under her thumb, so they said to her, we do not want to be your heir, and she, in a revenge, said, okay, fine, well, I'm not going to allow you to wed. But in the year 1280, she surrendered the scepter to her son Anarion and died in the year 1285 at the age of 412. And uh, um, her influence was affected 100 years following her death, that Anarion's youngest son Sirion would become the heir. So even after her death, she did something to her granddaughters in such a way that was horrific. They said, no, we don't want the throne. As to what was going on in Numenor, I think rather quiet business as usual. However, two things were going on. First off, the Numenorians were creating permanent settlements and havens. Rather, they did much to help the elves. That's debatable, but there were some Numenorians living there, which I think would be the origin of several cities within Gondor and in Umbar, which kind of shows that her father's influence was still felt. But it was also around this time that Sauron appeared disguised as Anatar, began to seduce the elves of Eregion. Anyway, in conclusion, this is the reign of the first ruling queen of Numenor, which I find interesting and very, very sad. Which I find interesting and very sad. I mean, it's interesting. She was the first ruling queen of Numenor, but she chose to give in to her resentment of her father being away all the time. And she took it out on everyone else. She took it out on the world, which probably could have benefited from more help from Numenor. She took it out on her own serving women. She took it out on her own granddaughters. That is quite terrible, and sad in of itself. Well, anyway, this is the Sage of Calidor. Thank you for your time, and please like, share, subscribe with your friends. Bye.